Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to A-Cube IAS. Now viewers, I'm Srikant Tripathi and today we'll be taking a segment from Environment and Ecology. Now viewers, today we'll be starting with biodiversity and the conservation that is associated with it in our country. Now viewers, when we speak about biodiversity, it is quite important for us to understand that what exactly biodiversity is. So when I'm using the term biodiversity, I have to make sure that I'm understanding this thing completely. Now when it comes to biodiversity, bio means life and diversity means the variation, or you can say about the diversification. That means when I'm saying biodiversity, so in biodiversity, I'm talking about both flora and fauna. For the beginners, it is quite important to understand what exactly flora is. So flora refers to the vegetation, that is, you can simple for your remember purpose, you can write down flora as similar to flowers. But here I'm talking about vegetation. The second one is fauna. So fauna here, it actually refers to the animal species, the rest of the species. So when I'm talking about biodiversity, so that means I'm talking about various kind of species, either in flora or in fauna. When they are being used collectively together, for them we use the term biodiversity. The second thing is biodiversity conservation. Now, obviously, viewers, we know that in this modern world, there are many threats to the nature. And one such threat is also looming upon the biodiversity. So, in order to control this threat, various organizations all across the globe, and if we talk about our country, we have taken many such initiatives. So all those initiatives, they qualify under the category of biodiversity conservation. Primarily, you must have heard these two terms, Nc2 conservation, the term Nc2 conservation and X-C2 conservation. We'll be discussing about these kind of conservations in the later section of the video. So viewers, let's move ahead. Example, we save the entire forest to save the tiger. This approach is called as the in situ or on-site conservation. Now, viewers, see, you must have heard of many initiatives taken by the government of India, such as Project Tiger, Project Elephant. So what exactly do you think? When I'm talking about Project Tiger, if I'm talking about a tiger reserve, that means in that particular tiger reserve, I'm not just conserving the tiger, but I am actually conserving the entire ecosystem. See, just imagine yourself. We are just focusing upon the conservation of tiger, and we are not focusing upon the rest of the forest or rest of the reserve. So what will happen? The conservation methods are being applied only for tiger, but not on other species and vegetation. At one point of time, that entire ecosystem will be completely gone. Now, tiger has to feed itself. From where exactly will he get his hunt? From where exactly he can make sure that he is feeding itself? So ultimately what will happen when the entire ecosystem is gone? Slowly and slowly we will see that the number of tigers in that particular area are dying of various reasons. Primarily, you can definitely say hunger. So when I'm talking about conservation of one particular species, so that means that particular species where exactly it is living, the natural habitat of that species, it is also being conserved. And this kind of conservation is known as the in situ, on-site conservation. See, in situ. That means I haven't shifted the species The species is living in its natural habitat. What I am doing is I am ensuring that this particular species is safe in its natural habitat. And in order to keep that species safe, I am putting all the efforts of conservation, and this method is known as the in-situ or on-site conservation. However, when there are situations when an animal or plant is endangered or threatened and need urgent measures to save it from extinction, ex-situ, off-site conservation is the desirable approach. Now, the second type that I said is the ex-situ. Ex-situ means, for example, let's talk about a couple of species. There is one very popular species in Jammu and Kashmir known as the Kashmiri Stag, or we also call it by the name Kashmiri Hangul. Okay, now Kashmiri Stag or Kashmiri Hangul. Importantly, we have to see and we have to understand that Kashmiri Stag is that particular species which is almost about to get extinct. Now, when I'm talking about such species whose numbers are almost near to extinct, or you can say that in a very soon time, the extinction of that particular species might take place. एक very important aspect यहाँ पे जो हमको देखना है वो ये कि how exactly the extinction took place. Now, one reason, very simple, that obviously anthropogenic activities, they play a very important role. If the humans are not concerned, then we will see that they are actually killing all those species. Just remember, there was a time in 2011 when the number of tigers in our country, it was reduced down to only 1,400 tigers. Today, we can definitely say that we have a population of tiger in our country almost 2,900 plus. But there was a time when this number came down to 1,400. So at that point of time, the government realized that we have to take very strict measures. Now, what exactly was the reason why their numbers came down to 1,400? Primarily, it were the people who were killing all those tigers. Now, this is one reason. Second reason could be a very important one. Second reason, it could be that natural extinction. The nature itself has decided, okay, the situation in which one particular species is living, that particular environment is not suitable for the survival of one particular species. So ultimately what will happen? The species will start dying. Same is the case that has happened with one species. In fact, you can say it's a rodent species found in Australia. In 2019 December, the government of Australia declared a species of rat that it became the first species to get extincted because of global warming. Now, yes, global warming is a human-induced impact, but somewhere down the line, the nature is also associated. Here, yes, definitely, the entire species of that particular rat was extincted. So, here, I'm referring to nature. The third one could be hunger. When I'm talking about hunger, see, there are many species present in an area, but there is no adequate food. So what will happen? There will be a struggle among the species. Now, in that struggle, whoso species is superior will definitely win over the inferior species. Ultimately, what will happen? The inferior species, it will die down. It will extinct. Now, when we speak about extinction or near extinctions, so these are the various reasons because of which such phenomena of extinction could take place. So that's exactly what I'm saying, that when we observe that a species is in very grave condition, or the numbers are really very serious, so what we do is we start taking such initiatives where the entire look after of the species is done under human observation. We have taken one particular species and we are actually providing a natural environment, a natural habitat to that particular species, but under human inspection. Every need of that particular species is looked after. It has been ensured that whatever is the requirement of this particular species survival, we have to provide all those things. So this kind of conservation becomes the Nc2 conservation. Now, when I speak about the benefits, what are the benefits of biodiversity conservation? So number one, conservation of biological diversity leads to conservation of essential ecological diversity to preserve the continuity of food chain. See, when I speak about conservation of biodiversity, one of the most important things which are associated, why we have to go for conservation of biodiversity? Because in order to protect the entire ecosystem, it is very important to go for the conservation of biodiversity. See, we know there is a food chain, okay? I'll just give you an example. See, there is a food chain. Now, let's say plant, okay? Then say you have insects. After insects, you have grasshoppers. And the most important one is lizard. Now, in this food chain, plant being the primary producer and lizard is the consumer. Lizard is the final consumer here. Now, in this particular chain, the natural producer, that is the plant, it produces, it is consumed by insects. Those insects are consumed by the grasshopper, and later on, those grasshoppers are consumed by the lizard. See, there is a sequence, there is a chain. Our earth can only sustain, like we have got our limitations, such as nature. This kind of situation, this kind of food chain is very important. If, just imagine, if just one thing or one species disappears from this entire food chain, the entire food chain will disrupt. Say, what will happen if plants are not present? No food to insect, ultimately insects will start dying. When insects will start dying, grasshoppers, they too at one point of time, they won't have any food, they will also start dying. At last, the lizard. Now, lizard also is actually dependent upon grasshoppers. Now, when grasshoppers are dying, at one point of time, when lizards have no food, they will also start dying. So, this is the importance of food chain. So, one very important fundamental that is associated with biodiversity conservation is, it is very important to protect biodiversity. Why? Because if we want to conserve the if we want to conserve the ecosystem, it is important to conserve the biodiversity as well. Then, the genetic diversity of the plants and animals is preserved. Yes, very obvious reason. One of the most important things is that genetic diversity. We have to see various kind of species with various genetic configuration. Okay. It ensures the sustainable utilization of life support systems on Earth. See, again, a very important aspect when I'm speaking about sustainable utilization of life support systems on Earth. You know, there are many cycles which we see. There is a natural carbon cycle, there is a natural nitrogen cycle, there is a natural phosphorus cycle. Everything is very important and everything is at its optimum. If it decreases or if it increases, it will have some or other kind of impact on the ecosystem. So biodiversity conservation actually maintains that particular sustainable utilization of life support systems on Earth. It provides a vast knowledge of potential use to the community. Absolutely. There are many such plants, there are many such vegetations that we know which have actually proven of great medical help. Now, when we have that entire information and knowledge about that particular vegetation or that particular plant species, we can definitely make it useful for us. But in order to make sure that it is available in plenty and it is available for generations after generations, we have to be very careful. We cannot be selfish here. Here we have to see that, okay, it is very useful, so I should use it. Even the generation that would come after me, they should use it. So we have to ensure that we are using all those species in a very optimum manner, and also we are doing something for their conservation as well. A reservoir of wild animals and plants is preserved, thus enabling them to be introduced if need be in the surrounding areas. Okay. Now, biodiversity conservation assures sustainable utilization of potential resources. Now, you have to just see that biodiversity conservation is the way out through which you can actually make sure that your entire ecosystem is safe. Ultimately, मूल मंत्र यही है biodiversity conservation का, that you have to ensure a sustainable utilization of all the resources, and it can be done only through biodiversity conservation. इसलिए important है. Now, let's come to details. In Nc2 conservation, that means the natural habitat of a particular species is actually being used for its conservation. That means we are not shifting that particular species from its natural habitat to an artificial environment. Okay. So Nc2 conservation. The Nc2 conservation is the on-site conservation of genetic resources in a natural population of plants and animal species. Okay, like I have already told you. In India, ecologically unique and biodiversity rich regions are legally protected as biosphere reserves, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, reserved forest, protected forest, nature reserves, etc. Now, if we speak with reference to India, it is quite important to see that in India, when it comes to Nc2 conservation, we are doing a tremendous job. For Nc2 conservation, we have wildlife sanctuaries, we have biosphere reserves, national parks, protected forest, reserved forest. Okay, so we are already doing very well. Okay, now most important, under the Man and Biosphere Program of UNESCO, India also started the initiative of starting the Biosphere Reserve. In 1986, this program got actually started, and the first Biosphere Reserve of the country was the Nilgidi Biosphere Reserve. Biosphere reserves are quite important for us, and you have to remember each and every one of them. There are a total of 18 Biosphere Reserves in the country. The first being the Nilgidi Biosphere Reserve, and the last one that was inducted in our Biosphere Reserve was the Panna Biosphere Reserve. The Panna Biosphere Reserve. Inducted when? Inducted in the year 2011. Okay. Now, plantation, cultivation, grazing, felling trees, hunting, poaching are prohibited in Biosphere Reserves, National Park and Sanctuaries. See, activities like cultivation, plantation, poaching, hunting, etc. All such illegal activities. Okay. Though plantation and cultivation cannot be called as illegal, but in order to preserve the ecosystem there, such things have been prohibited completely. Okay. There are several exceptions with reference to the tribals and all. We will discuss about that in the next video, right? It is quite important for you, okay, from prelims perspective, right? The National Board for Wildlife, chaired by the Prime Minister of India, provides for policy framework for the wildlife conservation in the country. NBWL, very important. Question can be asked, who chairs NBWL? So your answer has to be the Prime Minister of the country chairs the NBWL. Now it is the authority which is responsible for framing all the policies with reference to the biodiversity conservation. The National Wildlife Action Plan started from 2002 to 2016, was adopted in 2002, emphasizing the people's participation and their support for wildlife conservation. Again, viewers, a question can be definitely framed with reference to this particular thing. National Wildlife Action Plan started in the year 2002. Okay. Now, the focus was on to make sure or to actually increase people's participation for wildlife conservation, to make people more and more aware about the activities that are taking place. Some information about all the things. Reserved and protected forest. As of present, reserved and protected forest differ in one important way. See, when I speak about the reserved and the protected forest, you have to see the basic difference. Right to all activities like hunting, grazing, etc. in reserved forest are banned unless specific orders are issued otherwise. Okay. Now, when I speak about reserved forest, so activities like hunting, grazing, etc., they are banned. They can only be open when a specific order comes from the concerned authority. Difference has been asked previously in the UPSC examination about what is the difference between the reserved and the protected forest. So, this was something with reference to the reserved forest. In protected areas, right to activities like hunting and grazing are sometimes given to communities living on the fringes of the forest who sustain their livelihood from forest resources and products. However, in protected areas, some leniency is given to the tribals or to the original inhabitants of that particular forest. They are given several authorities, they are given several rights that yes, they can definitely go for grazing, they can let their cattle graze and they can also hunt the animals out there, but not the restricted ones. Okay, there will be a list that will be allotted that you can hunt only these particular species. If somebody says, okay, chalo, let's hunt tiger, so it's not going to be possible, right? So protected areas and reserved areas, reserved forest. Reserved forest, absolute ban, but only under specific order comes, right to permission of hunting and grazing can be allowed. In the protected areas, the people who are living, the original inhabitant of that particular place, they are given rights of hunting and grazing. Okay. The first reserve forest in India was the Satpura National Park in Madhya Pradesh. Again, quite important from examination perspective. They can ask you the first reserve forest. So what was the first reserve forest? The first reserve forest was Satpura National Park. Typically, the reserve forests are often upgraded to the status of wildlife sanctuaries, which in turn may be upgraded to the status of national park, with each category receiving a higher degree of protection and government funding. See, when I speak about a wildlife sanctuary, like I said, the order is reserve forest. After reserve forest, it can turn into a wildlife sanctuary. After a wildlife sanctuary, it can turn into a national park. Now, this actually shows the increase in the degree and authority. That means reserves, they have less funds. Wildlife sanctuary, they have quite more funds. Okay. When it comes to national park, their degree of superiority is quite high. They also receive a tremendous amount of fund from the government as well. So please remember, a reserve forest can be definitely inducted into a wildlife sanctuary. Also, a wildlife sanctuary can also be inducted into a national park. Right? The wildlife sanctuaries or the wildlife refuges are home to various endangered species. Now, viewers, endangered species is the term that you have heard here. Now, when I speak about endangered species, we will study about these species in our IUCN and red data book discussion. Now, IUCN is that authority which actually prepares this red data book, and this red data book has various species according to the numbers in which they are present. We have classified them. You will find terms like endangered species, critically endangered species, threatened species, nearly threatened species, near to extinction, extinction. So we will study about all that in IUCN and its red data book. So they are safe from hunting, predation and competition. Okay, they are safe from hunting, predation. That means cannot take place. The hunting cannot take place. Also, very importantly, predation, very clear it is given, predation and competition. That means when I speak about predation, if I am protecting one particular species in a wildlife sanctuary, ऐसा नहीं हो सकता है कि आपने कोई ऐसी स्पीशीज भी वहां पे इंट्रोड्यूस करवा करके रखी हुई है जो कि पहली वाली स्पीशीज को मार करके उसका सर्वाइवल पॉसिबल हो. No, it cannot happen that way. Very clear to understand. No predation. Also, competition. ऐसा भी नहीं हो सकता है, it cannot happen that way that you have put two species or for survival there is a competition going on between them. Because same is the case that actually happened in the Kashmiri Hanguls case. Now what happened? Kashmiri Hanguls were present in one particular area. Okay, on that very area, on that very region, a sheep breeding center was also introduced. Now we know that both sheeps and the hangul, it survives on grass, but the sheeps, they were quite higher in number. So slowly, steadily, what happened, the number of sheeps that were present all over the area, they started eating the entire food. And there was a competition that was between the sheeps and the Kashmiri Hanguls. Now, Kashmiri Hanguls being less in number and the sheeps, they were overcrowded. So ultimately what happened? The Kashmiri Hanguls, they started dying. People, the government, it failed to recognize that what exactly is the reason, even after being provided each and everything, why these people are dying, why these Hanguls are dying. Later on, it was found out that it is not because of any predation, but it is because of the competition, because of the hunger which these Kashmiri Hanguls are die. So there has not to be any kind of hunting. No hunting should be allowed in a wildlife sanctuary. Number two, predation. No other species which is a threat to the species will be introduced, and competition. The species cannot or should not die because of hunger. They are safeguarded from extinction in their natural habitat. Okay, in their natural habitat, a particular place is their natural habitat, and all the human induced actions are taken in order to protect that one particular species. Certain rights of people living inside the sanctuary could be permitted. Yet again, we have to see the people who are the original inhabitants of that particular place. Certain rights, yes, definitely, it can be given to all those people. But not to that extent where there is a threat to the species which is living. Grazing, firewood collection by tribal is allowed but strictly regulated. Okay, grazing of their cattle is allowed by the tribals also. They can definitely collect the firewood, but there are very strict regulations. Settlements are not allowed, few exceptions. Tribal settlements do exist. Constant efforts are made to relocate them. Now, outside settlement is not allowed. Anyone coming from outside and wants to settle in that particular wildlife sanctuary, no, not at all allowed. However, the tribals who are living there, the tribals who are present there, because they are the original inhabitants, they can live. However, the government is regularly taking such initiatives where these tribals, they can be relocated. A sanctuary can be promoted to a national park. This is what I discussed in the previous slide. Yes, a reserve forest can turn into a wildlife sanctuary. A wildlife sanctuary can turn into a national park. There are more than 500 plus wildlife sanctuaries in the country. मतलब इंडिया में लगभग 500 से ज़्यादा 500 plus wildlife sanctuaries are present. Now, the national parks. The national parks are the areas reserved for wildlife where they can freely use the habitats and the natural resources. The difference between a sanctuary and a national park mainly lies in the vesting of rights of the people living inside. Unlike a sanctuary where certain rights can be allowed, in a national park no rights are allowed. No grazing of any livestock shall also be permitted inside a national park. While in a sanctuary, the chief wildlife warden may regulate, control or prohibit it. Simple. Again, national parks are those places where the wildlife conservation takes place. If we speak about the difference between a wildlife sanctuary and a national park, the difference is very clear. Like I said, in a wildlife sanctuary, there are certain rights which are given to the people who are present inside it, such as grazing, okay, or collection of firewood. All such rights are absolutely prohibited when it comes to the case of a national park. No such rights are introduced, okay. However, one very important thing that you can say is that in a wildlife sanctuary, who can actually allocate those rights, who can actually regulate those rights? So the person who can regulate those rights is the chief wildlife warden. The chief wildlife warden in a wildlife sanctuary can actually give the rights to the people who are living there, that you can use, or you can just like for livestocks, you can allow the grazing of your livestock, okay? You can collect the firewood, etc., etc. But only, like I said, only under tough regulations. In national park, there is no such right which is given to the people there, okay? The National Wildlife Action Plan 2002 to 2016, I said, Wildlife Action Plan started in which year? 2002. Of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Control stipulated that state governments should declare land falling within 10 kilometers of the boundary of national parks and wildlife sanctuaries as eco-fragile zones or eco-sensitive zones under the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. Now, this National Wildlife Action Plan, it said to all the state governments that if there is a national park or wildlife sanctuary in your area, from all directions, another 10-kilometer area should be actually declared as eco-sensitive zone or eco-fragile zone. For example, I'll state here, let's say this is the territory of a national park. Now, according to the action plan, from all sides, to up to how much? 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers area. The boundary of a national park, where exactly it ends, from that boundary to the next further 10 kilometer area must be declared as the eco-sensitive zone or eco-fragile zones. The purpose of eco-sensitive zones was to provide more protection to the park by acting as a shock absorber or a transition zone. Now, simply, the most important reason why the idea of ESZ was introduced, very simple, very basic, to make sure that more protection is being granted to that particular sanctuary or that particular national park. Okay? Eco-sensitive zones would minimize forest depletion and man-animal conflict. See, man-animal conflict. When there is a national park, the boundary of that particular national park ends at one particular place. So if there were no eco-sensitive zones, yes, definitely, the species, various animal species, they might come out. And ultimately, it might be a threat to their own lives or to the human settlements outside there. So in order to avoid these human and animal conflicts completely, what the Wildlife Action Plan decided that just do one thing, increase another 10 kilometers area. The boundary of a national park ends at that particular place. You have added another 10 kilometers area just to make sure that even if a species comes out of a national park, it stays in that region where there is no threat to its life or any threat to the human settlements. The protected areas are based on the core and buffer model of management. The core and buffer model. Core areas or buffer model of management. Simply just understand, when I'm speaking of core, that means the human activity, human presence is absolutely not allowed. Buffer area. Buffer area is that particular place where there is limited, okay, under observation, under control, observation, you can say that such things are present, right? The core area has the legal status of being a national park. The buffer area, however, does not have a legal status of being a national park and could be a reserved forest, wildlife sanctuary, or a tiger reserve. Now, here, when I am saying core area has a legal status, that means the core zone, the core area is that place which actually can be called as it is a national park. However, the area outside core, that is the buffer region, it can be, okay, a wildlife sanctuary, or it can be a reserved forest, or it can be a tiger reserve. The buffer zone does not have any right, legal status. I'm talking about legal status. They do not have a legal status to be called as a national park, whereas the core region of that national park is actually the national park, right? Now, very important, the biosphere reserves. Large areas of protected land for conservation of wildlife, plants and animal resources, traditional life of tribals living in the area. Now, biosphere reserves were made under the idea of MAB, the MAB program. Now, this MAB program is called as the Man and Biosphere Program. The Man and the Biosphere Program. Now, when I'm speaking about the Man and the Biosphere Program, the idea was to just make sure that the humans are living comfortably, or there is no threat which is being posed to the species which are living in one particular area. So under that observation, we started biosphere reserves. So biosphere reserves, basically, they are a large area of protected lands. And it is for what? It is for the conservation of wildlife. It is for plants and animal resources. Also, it supports the presence of all the inhabitants which are living in that particular area. May have one or more national parks or wildlife sanctuaries in it. So see, there are various examples where you can say that inside a biosphere reserve, there might be a national park as well. You must have seen all such things. Best example would be the Nilgidi Biosphere Reserve, right? You have the famous Silent Valley National Park in the Nilgidi Biosphere Reserve. Now, when I speak about biosphere reserves, the biosphere reserves have a very simple funda. Okay. Now, what exactly is that? How the management takes place in biosphere reserves? See, if I say that this is the entire boundary of a biosphere reserve. This innermost region is known as the core. Outside this, the outer one, just outside of the core, you have the buffer zone. And here, the most outside one, it is known as the transition zone. Now, this is how a biosphere reserve, or you can say the core and buffer management, right? So, what exactly is a core area? It comprises a strictly protected ecosystem for conserving ecosystem species and genetic variations. In core or the natural zone, human activity is absolutely not allowed. Now, core area is the most protected. The number of rules and regulations present in the core area are the most. They are the maximum, right? And no kind of human activity is allowed except medicinal research, and not that medicinal research with not that perspective. just in order to look after how exactly the animal species who are present there are doing. Are they sick, or is there any threat, or are they suffering from any disease? Just in order to check all those things. At times, census purpose as well, in order to count, okay, specifically for tigers and all, right? The buffer zone, used for scientific research, monitoring, training, education. Okay, now this buffer zone, like I said, it is the zone right outside the core area. The purpose is to carry out various scientific research, monitor, training and education. Training, that means to train the people who are working out there, okay, be it the forest guards or be it the conservators. In order to properly train them, the area of buffer zone is being used, okay. Human activity is allowed, okay, but only up to a limited extent. The transition area, ecologically sustainable human settlements and economic activities are permitted. Now, the transition area is that particular area where you will actually find out all those human settlements, those tourist resorts, whenever people go for a jungle safari, etc. So, where exactly do you people go? You actually go to a transition area. With the cooperation of the reserve management and local people, several human activities like settlement, cropping, recreation and forestry are carried out without disturbing the environment. See, with a genuine support from the management authorities of that particular forest and various other responsible authorities, several human activities such as settlements, very important. If tribals are living, you cannot just tell them to leave. No, you can't. Cropping, okay, if people are living there, then definitely they will grow something, agriculture will be performed, so for their survival. Recreation and forestry are carried out. So the activities are carried out, but it has to be ensured that these activities are doing no harm or no disturbance to the species or to the animal species who are living in the buffer or the core region. Okay, so viewers, this was with today's session on biodiversity conservation. Today, I discussed you the one aspect of biodiversity conservation, that is the Nc2 conservation. In the further session, we will talk about the Nc2 conservation and what are the various initiatives that have been taken by the government of India for the biodiversity conservation here. So viewers, I hope you liked today's session. Thank you very much,